31-year-old Mary Catherine Edwards lived in Beaumont, Texas in 1995. She was a respected teacher and had a large circle of friends and a close-knit family. Mary was last seen on the evening of Friday, January 13th of 1995 at the new townhouse she just moved into. Her parents grew concerned the following day when she did not respond to phone calls. They went to her home to check on her welfare, and they found a horrific scene. Mary had been drowned in her own bathroom. She had been handcuffed, with her hands behind her back. An autopsy revealed that she had been assaulted as well. Investigators collected male DNA from her body and stored it for future use. For more than 25 years, the case remained unsolved. Then in April of 2020, investigators began using genetic genealogy to help find a suspect. They first found several distant cousins, which led them closer and closer to an arrest. Eventually, the DNA led them to Clayton Bernard Foreman. Foreman and Mary attended the same high school. They were also casual friends. Mary was even a bridesmaid at the wedding of Foreman and his first wife. Investigators also learned that the crime against Mary had similarities to a 1981 assault of one of Foreman's high school classmates. Foreman pleaded guilty to that crime and received 3 years of probation. Foreman was arrested in May of 2021 in Franklin County, Ohio, where he lived, and was charged with taking Mary Catherine Edwards' life. On Wednesday, September 22nd of 2021, Foreman was indicted. A date for the trial has not yet been released. 24-year-old Firozeh Deghanpour was a student at the University of Nebraska in Omaha in 1983. She disappeared from the college campus on August 13th of 1983 after attending her evening classes. Then, a day later, on August 14th, her body was discovered by fishermen under a bridge in Pigeon Creek in nearby Council Bluffs, Iowa. An autopsy would determine that Firozeh had been beaten, stabbed in the abdomen, and slashed in the throat. Over the next few months, several agencies worked together to try to find the culprit. Unfortunately, they were unable to, and the case went cold. Then, in 2020, one of Firozeh's friends reached out to investigators with the name of a possible suspect in the case. Investigators were quickly able to rule that person out because he had a solid alibi. When they took a new look at the case, though, they saw that detectives who worked on the initial investigation collected several pieces of evidence from the crime scene that might be useful now with advances in DNA technology. The evidence included a bra, underwear, blouse, notebooks, computer printouts, work gloves, prescription glasses, a beer can, and 2 pens. All of these items had been stored at the sheriff's office for nearly 4 decades. Investigators sent the items to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation Laboratory for DNA testing and learned in March of 2021 that a blood-stained glove found at the scene contained Firozeh's DNA and that of a male. They were able to match the unidentified DNA to Bud Leroy Christensen through the National Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, database. Investigators also found Christensen's fingerprints on papers that had been found near the body. Christensen has a long criminal history with many similar crimes that he has committed over the years. On April 30th of 2021, authorities announced that Christensen had been arrested and charged with taking Firozeh's life. Crime scene technician Hadley Mikovic said during the press conference that the arrest in the case was made possible because of the significant technological advances in DNA analysis in recent decades. I would like to encourage the family and friends of victims to never give up hope and continue to work diligently with law enforcement agencies handling their investigations. Let Firozeh's case be an example that it is never too late to seek answers, she said. Firozeh's brother and father, who live in London and Iran respectively, were notified that an arrest was made. In late January of 1994, the owner of Bob's Car Wash in Jeanerette, Louisiana, made a gruesome discovery. He was taking out the trash when he found a deceased female baby inside a 55-gallon garbage can behind his business. The local coroner, Dr. James Falterman, did the autopsy. He also delivered the eulogy at the unnamed girl's funeral and addressed the 200-plus mourners. He said that when he saw the infant with her thumb in her mouth, he began to have cold thoughts of anger, of depression, and sadness. Dr. Falterman also noted that the girl was alive when she was thrown away, and that she probably lived just a few hours before succumbing to the cold. I couldn't find a sketch of the baby, but she was described as black and female and was named Baby Jane Doe. The acting police chief at the time, Kerry Davis, vowed to find the child's mother. It may not have happened on his watch, and it may have taken 25 years, but authorities say that it finally happened. The child's mother, 50-year-old Sonia Charles of New Iberia, was arrested in September of 2019. The Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit recently reopened the case after new leads were developed. The department's spokesperson, Major Wendell Rayborn, explained that a local cold case group helped bring renewed attention to the case and that new leads were brought to investigators' attention. DNA evidence collected from both baby Jane Doe and the crime scene was recently re-examined by a local laboratory, which in turn developed a DNA profile. That DNA profile, according to the Sheriff's Department, matched a sample obtained from Sonia Charles. Private investigator Stephen Maynard started the Cold Case Advocacy Group, which shone a new spotlight on this case. It's going to take a long time to heal. Family members know who she is now, he said. Maybe the baby can finally get a name. In May of 2021, an Iberia Parish grand jury indicted 52-year-old Sonia Parrish for taking the life of her newborn daughter. Following the indictment, she was booked into the Iberia Parish Jail on a $250,000 bond. Charles faces life in prison without parole if convicted. "45-year-old Susan Tice lived in Toronto, Canada in 1983. She was a mother of 4 children and worked as a social worker. Her body was found in the upstairs bedroom of her recently purchased home on Grace Street on August 17, 1983. She had moved to Toronto from Calgary in July and separated from her husband, who was living in a downtown townhouse. By the time her body was found by a relative, the mail had piled up outside of her home. She had suffered multiple stab wounds to the chest. An autopsy was unable to determine when exactly her life ended. Police admitted that they had few leads on the case. A detective said at the time, "We have no suspect at all." 4 months later, on December 20th of 1983, 22-year-old Erin Gilmour's body was found in her Toronto apartment. A friend who went to pick her up for a cocktail party found Erin's body. Like Susan Tice, Erin had been stabbed, assaulted, and found in her bedroom. Police canvassed door to door to no avail. Erin was an aspiring clothing designer from a wealthy family. Her father, David Gilmour, had been the business partner of tycoon Peter Monk, co-founder of the mining company Barrick Gold. It was Monk's son who found Erin's body. For years, then decades, investigators knew little about what happened to Susan and Erin, except that they suffered a similar fate. In 2008, advances in DNA technology brought a break, confirming through evidence at the scenes that one man was responsible for what happened to both Susan and Erin. But it would take nearly 15 more years and even greater scientific advances to identify who he was. Recently, via a combination of advanced genetic sequencing, forensic genealogy, and traditional police work that's now regularly cracking open decades-old cases, investigators arrested 60-year-old Joseph George Sutherland from Moosonee, Ontario, Canada, in connection with Susan and Erin's cases. Moosonee is a remote community far removed from the slayings that police allege he committed nearly 40 years ago. Detective Sergeant Stephen Smith, the lead Toronto police investigator, speculated that Sutherland had been waiting for the knock to come at the door. Smith told reporters that a second phase of the investigation must now begin. A painstaking review of Sutherland's whereabouts in the intervening 39 years. Obviously, we're going to look into every possible connection to any possible case throughout Ontario to ensure that he isn't responsible for any other offenses, Smith said. The cases are just the latest advances through genetic genealogy, a cutting-edge process that has breathed new life into old cases all but declared unsolvable. Detective Smith said that the scientific advances were the only way the cases were ever going to be solved. Joseph Sutherland was 22 years old at the time that he took the lives of Susan and Erin. He was never a suspect in the case, nor had he ever been interviewed. He had been living in Toronto at the time, but later moved to Moosonee. A Facebook profile for Sutherland reveals a person going about a seemingly normal life, enjoying the outdoors and requesting recommendations for services like an electrician, while griping with everyday problems. Retired Toronto detective Mark Mendelson said that investigators can also turn to classic techniques to identify any other crimes they believe Sutherland may be responsible for, including photo lineups. If previous cases had eyewitnesses as well as fingerprint analysis, now that Sutherland's fingerprints will be in a centralized system known as AFIS, he said it's also entirely possible that Sutherland never went on to commit other violent acts. But he said there isn't enough statistical data about serial criminals to have an informed discussion about it. The former cop said one thing is certain. It's a clear example of, ain't science wonderful? Sutherland is scheduled to appear in court soon in 2023. One of Erin Gilmour's brothers, Sean McCowan, had this to say about the arrest. The best call I've ever received. This is a day that I, and we, have been waiting almost an entire lifetime for, McCowan said. For nearly 4 decades, the culprit had been a ghost, said McCowan, adding that his mother, who passed away 2 years ago, never recovered from the loss of her only daughter. She would have been so relieved that there had been an arrest, and so happy that someone will face justice after being anonymous for 39 years, McCowan said. On May 23rd of 1992, a woman's body was found dumped behind a construction shed in North Memorial Drive, just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. She was quickly identified as 31-year-old Kim Marlene McVey. Kim had been shot in the head. There were no known witnesses to the crime, and no DNA evidence. No one came forward with useful information, and the case went cold. But then recently, witnesses did come forward. They told police that a man by the name of Tommy Edward Harris confessed to them that he took Kim's life. Kim, Harris, and a few other unnamed individuals were staying in the same house. The house was described as a known drug house. On May 16th of 1992, 7 days before her body was found, a man entered the house to settle a deal that had gone bad. This individual wanted to get his money back. A gun battle then took place. This man took Kim in a headlock and dragged her outside. The man then made demands of Tommy Harris. Harris fired a gun and it struck Kim in the left temple. Harris then dragged her body into the house and later hid her remains behind the shed out back. Tommy Harris was arrested on May 14th of 2020. Tulsa County Sheriff Vic Regalado said this is a bittersweet moment. Bitter in the fact that Kim McVey still has family. They have been notified, but they're out of state and were unable to be here today. Our hearts certainly go out to them. And sweet in the fact that we now have been able to provide closure to her family. It was years in the making, but again, at the end of the day, justice is sometimes slow-moving, but still happens. The man who entered the house looking for money has since passed away. Kim's family, who did not attend the police briefing, also have not yet made a statement after hearing about the arrest. Rachel Johnson was a single mother who lived in Akron, Ohio in 1991. In March of the same year, she had been in a friend's vehicle when they got a flat tire. They pulled into the parking lot of a convenience store at the corner of Dan Street and Glenwood Avenue. A small faded gray vehicle pulled into the lot behind them. Rachel got into that vehicle and drove off with the man. It is believed that the man offered to take her home. However, later in the day, her body was discovered on Weller Avenue. She was assaulted, stabbed multiple times, and even set on fire after being dumped in the street. Investigators collected DNA evidence from Rachel's body. They entered it into databases, but did not find a match. It was only in 2019, when the Akron Police Department partnered with Advanced DNA, that a match could be made. Advanced DNA is a genetic testing company in Texas that has helped solve a lot of cold cases recently. In March of 2020, 57-year-old Daniel Lee Reese was arrested in connection with the case. His DNA matched the suspect's DNA that was found at the crime scene back in 1991. Reese, who would have been 28 years old at the time of the crime, was booked into the Summit County Jail. He is apparently known to Rachel's family. Reese had been spotted in the same area that she was last seen alive, but he was never looked into during the initial investigation. Reese also lived right across the street from Rachel. After he took her life, he would often spend time with her daughter, who went to live with Rachel's mother. The daughter never expected that this man she knew from childhood was the man who took her mother's life. Detective James Pashelik said that the DNA was the key to solving this case. That's what broke the case. He also said that it was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. And in this case, we have. 21-year-old Julie Ann Gonzalez lived in Dripping Springs, Texas in 2010. She was married to George De La Cruz, but they were estranged and not living together. The two were in the middle of getting a divorce. Julie and George had a young daughter named Layla together, who was about 2 years old at the time. Julia was always busy with her job as a pharmacy technician, going to school and spending time with her daughter. She was described as hardworking and a kind-hearted person. Julie's loved ones stated how she had embraced her motherly duties and was bringing her child up independently. On March 26th of 2010, Julie was last seen by George. He said that Julie had come over to drop their daughter off as they shared custody of her. Julie's aunt, Dora Soto, expected Julie to contact her that day, but she did not. Dora tried to reach her, but failed to do so. When she did not respond to texts and calls, her family began to wonder. Julie's aunt, her mom Sandra, and sister Samantha spoke to George. George claimed that Julie told him she was going away for a few days on a trip. They all said that Julie would not have left behind her daughter and would have at least told one family member that she was leaving. Julie's family said her daughter was her world, and she would never leave her behind. Julie was also very reliable and in constant contact with her family. By 11 p.m. that night, Julie's aunt and mom reported her missing to the Austin, Texas police. The police did not have any evidence that Julie hadn't left of her own accord. They said that she was an adult and was allowed to leave. Julie's mom and aunt mentioned that her new car was also missing. The next day, on March 27th of 2010, Julie's family and her new boyfriend, Erin, were receiving text messages from her. Julie's sister believed it was her as she had referred to her by her nickname. Julie's aunt, mom, and boyfriend weren't so sure. Erin had just received a message from Julie that she was breaking up with him. Her mom was shocked because Julie was madly in love with him. Julie, or someone using her phone, had also posted a message on Facebook that she was depressed and posted some messages to her MySpace page. On MySpace, Julie had wrote that she had met a man named James in Colorado and couldn't wait to start her life over there. Julie's aunt and mom knew that these messages weren't Julie. Julie would not have left her daughter, and it wasn't how she would write. Erin asked Julie to tell him what his middle name was. The person on the other end said they don't have time for games and never sent any other messages to Julie's family members. Investigators still weren't sure if she left on her own or if foul play was involved. But they did speak to George, as he was the last person who saw Julie alive. George only told them that Julie dropped off their daughter and then she left abruptly. Julie's family began their own investigation. Her aunt went driving around South Austin and spotted Julie's new car in the parking lot of a Walgreens. Her aunt ran inside, looked all over the store for Julie, but she was nowhere to be found. Concerned about what she could find, Julie's aunt contacted Julie's mother. Together, they checked Julie's trunk but didn't find her. They did spot a paper bag in the back seat, which had asthma medication inside for Julie's daughter. It wasn't like Julie to not give George such an important medication for their own daughter. Julie's family asked one of the employees inside Walgreens if Julie had been there. They showed him a picture and he said she looked familiar. They also asked him if he knew anything about the car outside. He said that a girl had entered the store and she said she was having car issues. The police obtained the surveillance footage from Walgreens. There were several women that matched the description of Julie, but Julie herself had not entered the store. Julie's family then plastered the city with a billboard, posters, and handed out t-shirts with Julie's picture on them. The police looked at Julie's phone records and social media accounts. Her phone and social media had gone quiet. It hadn't been used since March 27th of 2010, the day after she was last seen. George's mom, Victoria de la Cruz, made a frantic phone call to the police. She asked them to come to her house. Victoria called them because she had found a large hole in the storage shed of the home she shared with her son. Victoria told them that she started to dig, but then she got scared and decided it's best to call the police. When detectives arrived, Victoria was covered in dirt and was clearly shaken. The hole that she had contacted them about looked eerily like a grave. George told the police that the hole was an electrical trench. Investigators decided to dig anyway, but found no sign of Julie in the hole. The police obtained Julie's bank records. They found that on the day Julie was last seen, George had used her card at Walmart and Best Buy. George had purchased an Xbox points card at Best Buy because he had an obsession with video games. His obsession was one of the reasons he and Julie got divorced. George would have rather stayed home all day to play video games than to work and earn money. Victoria gave the police permission to search the house. Inside, they found the purchases from both stores and a receipt from Best Buy. The police obtained the surveillance footage from both stores. They saw George with his daughter at both stores. Jim Cook, a wireless expert, examined George's phone to map out his movements on March 26th of 2010. He also compared them to Julie's phone. Julie and George's phones both moved together, which proved that George had possession of her phone. George had also accessed his MySpace page and Julia's page from the same IP address. The police also looked at George's Xbox activity. George was known to play video games for around 12 to 15 hours a day. On March 26th, he hadn't played for about 20 hours. The police believed George had done something to Julie, but they did not have much evidence to even prove that she was not alive anymore. Unfortunately, the case then went cold for some time. For 3 years, Julie's family waited for answers and had to share custody with George. Julie's mom asked George constantly if Julie was going to come back. George always told her she was going to someday. Finally, on September 13th of 2013, George De La Cruz was arrested and charged with taking Julie Ann Gonzalez's life. The prosecution offered George a reduced sentence of 50 years if he cooperated and told them where Julie's body was. George always denied being involved. He rejected the offer and decided to plead not guilty. George's trial began in April of 2015. George never showed remorse, but seemed nervous. The prosecution didn't have a body, but needed to convince the jury that Julie was never coming back. They said a knife, ammunition, and some clothing that appeared to have been burned was also found in the De La Cruz's backyard and shed. Yet, defense lawyer Robert McCabe and Keith Lauerman contended that prosecutors had left too many loose ends and too many unanswered questions. They attacked the state expert's analysis, raised questions about its witnesses, and said the timeline prosecutors had offered was impossible. George De La Cruz, who was described as an immature and irresponsible heavy video game player, would not have had the time or wherewithal to clean his home, dispose of his estranged wife's remains, and dig a hole in his backyard to bury her. All before he was captured on security camera footage shopping with their daughter, McCabe said. Convictions are about knowledge, the attorney argued. You convict on fact, not fantasy. You convict on logic, not emotions. When you don't, he told jurors, innocent people end up in prison. On April 22nd of 2015, George De La Cruz was found guilty. He put his head down while Julie's family celebrated. In October of 2016, 27-year-old George was sentenced to life in prison. At present, he remains incarcerated at the Jim Ferguson Unit in unincorporated Madison County, Texas. He will be eligible for parole in the year 2043. Julie's family said that they are praying that George will someday tell them where Julie is. They hope that he will let his daughter know what really happened to her mom. In February of 2023, the house belonging to Julie's mother, Sandra Soto, burned down. She and her family were able to get out safely after being woken up by their dog. However, the house was destroyed and they lost everything. A benefit was held at Jack's Roadhouse in San Marcos to help the family. The benefit featured homemade barbecue and live music. The family was encouraged by the support they've gotten from total strangers as they deal with this latest setback. Julie's sister Samantha Petrie said, "We have been through a lot, and at first when I got the news, I did think this was just one more thing being thrown at us. Today, it really shows that not just love and support from our family and our friends, but people that know the story of my sister Julie Ann Gonzalez, that they do not forget about our family and they don't forget about her story." Dennis and Brenda Bowman were a married couple with 2 children from Holland, Michigan in 1989. They lived on the corner of Lincoln Road and 52nd Street. Dennis worked as a wood machinist and Brenda used to work at the jewelry counter at the Meyer department store. Their 2 children were Aundria and Vanessa Bowman. Aundria was born on June 23rd of 1974 as Alexis Badger. Her biological parents are Kathy Turkanian and Randy Badger. Before her first birthday, she was adopted by Dennis and Brenda Bowman and renamed. Vanessa was born in January of 1988. Aundria went from being an only child to more than a big sister. She was a third parent to the chubby redheaded baby. While other kids her age went to after-school clubs and Friday night football games, Aundria stayed home changing diapers and cleaning bottles. On March 11th of 1989, Dennis Bowman contacted police. He told them that he had come home from his job to find 14-year-old Aundria missing. Dennis said that some of Aundria's belongings along with $100 from his dresser was also missing. He told police that Aundria was a troubled teenager who frequently fought with her mother and had run away to a friend's house once before. With no foul play suspected, the police labeled Aundria a runaway and passed her case along to the Youth Services Bureau. Few people who knew the Bowmans questioned the official narrative. Over the years, there had been whispers about the family. Once, when Aundria was in middle school, she boarded the school bus bleeding from her wrist. Some kids gossiped that she attempted to take her own life, but others said Aundria had cut herself trying to get back into her house after her parents locked her out. There were rumors that Dennis, a former Navy reservist with reddish-brown hair, a goatee, and wire-rimmed glasses, and Brenda, a portly woman with curled bangs, abused Aundria. But back then, what happened behind closed doors was considered family business. Many people in Holland assumed that Aundria had gotten so fed up with her home that she finally split. Maybe she'd gone looking for her birth mother. People heard that she'd hitched a ride to a local truck stop and had left town with an older boy, or was pregnant. Brenda reported a series of tips in the weeks and months following her daughter's disappearance, all of which seemed to confirm that Aundria had run away. A single photograph formed most people's memory of her. It was given to the police when she first vanished. In it, Aundria is sitting against a blue studio backdrop and looking just off camera, with her green eyes cast upward. Photos of missing children were often printed on the sides of milk cartons or on flyers taped to the top of pizza delivery boxes. Aundria's picture wound up somewhere else. In 1993, the band Soul Asylum debuted a music video for its song Runaway Train, featuring the images and names of missing kids across America. The video was a huge hit, with several versions airing on MTV and VH1. In the one that played in Michigan, Aundria's photo appears just after the 2-minute mark. Reflecting on the video 20 years after its release, director Tony Kaye claimed that more than 24 missing children were found because of the video. Unfortunately, Aundria Bowman wasn't one of them, and her case went cold. The next major update in Aundria's case would come in 2010 when Carl Koppelman stepped in. Carl took an interest in true crime, which led him to Web Sleuths. It is a forum where crime hobbyists and armchair detectives connect and collaborate on unsolved cases. Carl spent countless hours scrolling through the national database of missing persons and unidentified bodies known as NamUs. There is an overlap between the two main parts of the database, the disappeared and the deceased. Carl tried to match the characteristics of people who had gone missing with those of unidentified remains found. When Carl noticed that the age and condition of some of the bodies might make it difficult for loved ones to recognize them, it sparked an idea. He started creating lifelike renderings of Jane and John Does based on photos taken post-mortem. Some of the solved cases that we've covered on this channel before have been solved because of these renderings. Once he finished a rendering, Carl sent it to NamUs, and the database would sometimes publish it. He also posted his work on Web Sleuths so other armchair detectives could use it in their identification efforts. Eventually, Carl began working with police departments and the DNA Doe Project, which identifies human remains through genetic testing and genealogical research. Carl got interested in the case of the Racine County Jane Doe. She was found near the edge of a Wisconsin cornfield in 1999. She had been not alive for about 12 hours, but rain washed away any evidence that might have been useful to investigators. It seemed likely that the young woman's life was taken elsewhere and dumped. An autopsy determined that she may have been cognitively disabled and that she had suffered long-term abuse and neglect. She had broken bones and a cauliflower ear, and her body showed signs that she was assaulted. More than 50 people from the farming community where she was found attended her funeral. She was found wearing a men's gray and silver Western-style shirt embroidered with red flowers. On NamUs, Carl plugged in some general search criteria, gender, age, location, and clicked through the results for missing persons. In most cases, the answer was a clear no. The age didn't match or the location made no sense, but one entry gave Carl hope: Aundria Bowman. Aundria and the Racine County Jane Doe shared physical characteristics and their ages aligned. Aundria would have been 25 in 1999 when the Jane Doe's life was taken. Holland, where Aundria disappeared, sits directly across Lake Michigan from where the Jane Doe was found. It's just 4 hours by car from one location to the other. Carl took his theory to law enforcement, who found it compelling enough to actually investigate. To determine whether the Jane Doe was Aundria, police would need to compare DNA from the body with that of someone in Aundria's family. Because Aundria was adopted, authorities had to track down her birth mother, which took a while. Aundria's birth mother is Kathy Turkanian. In 1972, at the age of 14, she ran away from her family. Kathy left Virginia where they lived and hitchhiked to Memphis, Tennessee, and she had no money. Kathy met 19-year-old Randy Badger. In December of 1972, Kathy and Randy traveled to South Carolina, where it was legal for a minor to get married if they had parental permission. Kathy's parents gave it gladly because they did not want to be responsible for her at all. The couple were married less than a year when Kathy found out she was pregnant. On June 23rd of 1974, Kathy gave birth to a healthy daughter. She named her Alexis. When Alexis was 5 months old, Kathy and Randy separated and she went back to live with her parents in Virginia. Kathy realized she was going to receive no help from her family and couldn't give Alexis the life that she wanted to. Alexis was put up for adoption and was soon adopted by Dennis and Brenda Bowman. In April of 2010, police working on Aundria's case sent a letter to Kathy Turkanian's home. The letter explained that Aundria disappeared from her adoptive home and that she might be a Jane Doe found in Wisconsin. Police needed a sample of Kathy's DNA to know for sure. Kathy was willing to share her DNA, but she wanted to know more about what had happened to her daughter. In the letter, it gave no details, and Kathy didn't even know that her name was changed to Aundria Bowman. She searched online for information about missing girls in Michigan. It didn't take long to find one from the town of Holland, whose birthday and physical description matched Alexis's. When she saw the girl's school photo, Kathy thought Aundria Bowman could be her daughter. In her quest to find out more about Aundria, she connected with Carl Koppelman. While waiting for the DNA test results, Kathy also got in touch with a retired Michigan detective named Pat O'Reilly. Pat told Kathy that Aundria's adoptive father, Dennis Bowman, was responsible for her disappearance. Let's take a deeper look at Dennis and other crimes he committed. In May of 1980, a 19-year-old woman was riding her bike north of Holland, Michigan, when a motorcyclist forced her off the road. The man told her to get off her bike and walk into the woods. The young woman didn't move. The man pulled out a gun, fired a shot past her, and repeated the order. Still, she didn't budge. The man fired the gun again, this time at the ground near her feet.
He said he would shoot her next. Just then, a car drove by, and the motorcyclist turned his head towards the noise, and the young woman took the opportunity to pedal away as fast as she could. The man didn't shoot or give chase, and she was able to flag down someone in a pickup truck who drove her home. Her parents called the police, and the young woman provided a description of the suspect. A white male with tinted glasses and a blue helmet. His motorcycle, she said, had a blacktop case mounted on the back. By the end of the day, the police had detained a suspect. The young woman took one look at him and confirmed that he was the man who tried to attack her. It was Dennis Bowman, who by then was already a husband and a father. At the time, Aundria was almost 6 years old. Dennis was convicted of assault with intent to commit criminal conduct and sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. He was referred for psychological counseling, and a judge determined that he would likely pose a danger to women if he was free. Still, Dennis served the minimum sentence. One day in 1998, a state trooper in Dorr, Michigan, responded to an alarm at the mobile home of 28-year-old Vicki Vanden Brink. She'd reported so many break-ins that the sheriff's department had installed a security system. When the trooper arrived at the scene, he found Dennis Bowman walking away from the back door. The Bowmans had moved to Hamilton, a town nestled between Holland and Dorr. In 1989, shortly after Aundria's disappearance, Dennis told the officer he was temporarily staying with Vicki Vanden Brink, who was a former co-worker of his. He was let go, but when authorities got in touch with Vicki, who wasn't home when the alarm went off, she said Dennis was lying. Dennis then changed his story, telling law enforcement that he'd entered the trailer to use the bathroom. He'd been there at least once before, he claimed, when his daughter Vanessa wanted to sell Girl Scout cookies to Vicki. Skeptical, the police obtained Dennis's permission to search his property. In the loft of an outbuilding, they found a black duffel bag containing lingerie that was later identified as Vicki Vanden Brink's, as well as a short-barreled shotgun, a black sweatshirt, and a mask. Kathy Turkanian learned the details of Dennis Bowman's criminal record after submitting a Freedom of Information Act request based on what Detective Pat O'Reilly had told her. After seeing what he did to other women, Kathy became convinced that Dennis Bowman took Aundria's life. If Kathy was right, it would mean that the Racine County Jane Doe wasn't Aundria. That theory made sense only if Aundria was still alive 10 years after she disappeared. In 2013, the long-awaited DNA results confirmed it. Kathy was not related to the Jane Doe. In September of 2013, Kathy and Carl met in person at the Missing in Michigan conference. Organized by the state police, the conference was designed to raise awareness about and hopefully generate leads for cold cases. Kathy and Carl showed up in custom shirts they made that read, "Find Aundria Bowman." Carl scanned the room and was surprised when his eyes landed on familiar faces. He nudged Kathy, and she looked over. "That's Vanessa," she said. "And that's Brenda." Brenda recognized Kathy because she saw that Kathy said on Facebook that she believes Dennis is responsible. Brenda seemed eager to explain her side of the story. She insisted that she and Dennis had fully cooperated with police after Aundria's disappearance. She presented a binder full of notes and missing persons flyers as proof. She recounted sightings of Aundria. It was clear she still believed that the teenager had run away. According to Carl, when he brought up Dennis's criminal record, Brenda replied, "I haven't forgotten what he did, but I do forgive him. I take my marriage vows very seriously." After the conference, Kathy hired a private investigator named Jeffrey Floor. He managed to get his hands on Aundria's police file, which Kathy and Carl had never seen. Oddly, the earliest documents in it were from March of 1989 when Aundria disappeared. They were dated 4 months earlier. That was when police responded to allegations of abuse in the Bowman home. The report did not go into detail about what happened, noting only that local authorities had determined that the allegations were not true. Carl and Kathy were sure that law enforcement had missed something. In 2017, Kathy and Carl met up with Chris Haverdink, the detective who'd taken over Aundria's case. Haverdink agreed that Bowman was suspicious, but that wasn't enough to arrest him. On November 22nd of 2019, Dennis Bowman was arrested by the Allegan County Sheriff's Office. But not because of anything to do with Aundria. He'd been arrested in relation to a crime committed 9 years before Aundria disappeared, more than 800 miles away from the shores of Lake Michigan. Bowman was arrested because he apparently took the life of Kathleen Doyle in 1980. 25-year-old Kathleen had been stripped, gagged, strangled with an electrical cord, then assaulted and stabbed. Investigators collected male DNA from her body, but had few leads until Henry Lee Lucas was arrested in 1983. Lucas claimed that he and a partner named Otis Toole were responsible. His confessions were later revealed to be false and the charges were dropped. Eventually, science caught up with the case. Genetic genealogy, which compares unidentified DNA with a huge number of samples stored in databases, was becoming a very popular way of investigating these cold cases. Norfolk investigators partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a leader in the field, to test the DNA collected at Kathleen's crime scene. Soon, based on genealogical research, they had a list of more than 30 suspects. In 2019, after some more testing and police work, it led investigators to Dennis Bowman. Bowman was extradited to Virginia to stand trial. By then, he had already confessed. He admitted to entering Kathleen Doyle's home through a back window. He claimed that he was drunk and that it was an attempted robbery. He said he didn't expect to find Kathleen in the house and that he didn't plan to take her life, but she was in the house and he did take her life. At the time, Bowman was in Norfolk for his annual 2-week service in the Navy Reserve. He was also out of jail on bond. He was awaiting trial for the attempted assault of the 19-year-old Holland woman, the one he fired a gun at before she escaped on her bike. Kathy learned that she'd inadvertently played a role in solving Kathleen Doyle's case. Jeffrey Floor, a private detective, told her that at some point the Bowmans had visited the Allegan County Sheriff's Office to report Kathy for harassment. They claimed she was making defamatory accusations about Dennis online. Investigators offered Dennis a bottle of water and kept it when he left. According to Floor, that was how his DNA came into their possession. In the first week of February of 2020, with a thick layer of snow blanketing the ground, police returned to the Bowmans' property. There was a forensics team on site this time, with a crime scene tent and dogs in the backyard. Officials appeared to be concentrating on one area in particular, and they had started to dig. Later that day, the police held a press conference. They announced that human skeletal remains had been found and that they likely belonged to Aundria Bowman. The police needed to confirm that it was in fact Aundria. Kathy provided her DNA immediately. In March of 2020, Almost 31 years to the day after Aundria disappeared, the results came back. There was a DNA match. Dennis claimed that what happened to Aundria was an accident. He said that they were arguing and he slapped her, causing her to fall and break her neck. He reported her missing to cover it up. That was the story that he told Brenda in correspondence from prison. In June of 2020, Dennis received 2 life sentences plus 20 years for taking the life of Kathleen Doyle. He was legally ordered to serve his time in Michigan, where he would stand trial for what he did to Aundria. The first hearing was held in February of 2021. Brenda took the stand first. She tearfully recounted how she'd made missing persons posters because she really believed that Aundria had run away. She said she learned the truth only after Dennis was arrested in the Kathleen Doyle case. When she was asked whether Aundria had ever accused Dennis of abusing her, Brenda said yes, but that she didn't believe the allegations were true. "That's a lie," she told Aundria, "and you know it." It was Brenda who told police where to find Aundria's remains. In a call from prison, Dennis had confessed to burying their daughter in the backyard. Brenda said she didn't believe him at first. They hadn't lived in their house in Hamilton when Aundria's life was taken, so how could he have buried her there? To Brenda's horror, Dennis explained that he'd moved their daughter's body to the new property as soon as they signed papers for it. The cement slab in the yard was the headstone of a grave that Brenda never even knew was there, in the shadow of the house she and Dennis shared for nearly 30 years. He didn't lie this time, Brenda told the detective when Aundria's remains were found. He didn't lie. As other witnesses took the stand, Dennis sat quietly in a green shirt, bow tie, and face mask. On December 22nd of 2021, Bowman pleaded no contest. He was sentenced to an additional 35 to 50 years in prison for taking Aundria Bowman's life. Bowman confessed to an assault from 1979. The crime was featured on the front page in the Holland Sentinel, published October 18th of 1979. The article detailed a very violent attack on a 27-year-old woman who early on a Sunday morning was bound, gagged, and assaulted by an intruder in her home. The perpetrator took cash before fleeing the scene and was described as a white man between 25 and 30 years old with sandy hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He was estimated at 5'6", 150 pounds, and according to the young woman, her assailant was wearing a leather jacket and dark pants. The newspaper published a police sketch of the suspect, his ink-blotted pupils staring blankly from the front page. According to the lead detective in the case, there had been a recent uptick in reports of prowlers in the neighborhood where the crime had occurred. Police suspected that the attacker might have committed other crimes. This potentially means that there are a lot more cases that could be tied to Bowman. For those wondering, the Racine County Jane Doe was later identified as Peggy Johnson. Peggy was never reported missing. She was last seen at a homecoming dance in Harvard, Illinois in 1994. Most people who knew her assumed that she had just run away. An aunt worried enough to take out a classified ad in the paper, but nobody seemed to suspect that something terrible might have happened to the auburn-haired girl. Peggy disappeared shortly after her mother passed away, the sole parent in her low-income household. The 19-year-old found herself orphaned and homeless, with a developmental disability that made it difficult for her to get a job. By chance, she met a nurse named Linda LaRoche who offered her work as a live-in housekeeper and nanny to her children. The teenager jumped at the opportunity. But over the next 5 years, LaRoche abused Peggy Johnson, beating her, starving her, and forcing her to live in a crawl space. The violence culminated in 1999 when LaRoche allegedly ended 23-year-old Peggy's life and dumped her body in Raymond, Washington. No one could identify her, so she became known by the place where she was found, the Racine County Jane Doe. 20 years after Peggy's life was taken, Wisconsin police received a tip from a concerned citizen about a nurse who confessed to taking someone's life who worked for her in the late 1990s. In early November of 2019, Racine County authorities announced both Peggy's identity and LaRoche's arrest. In May of 2022, a judge in Racine County sentenced Linda LaRoche to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was also given an additional 5-year sentence for hiding Peggy's body. Peggy's step-aunt, Jenny Schroeder, had this to say to LaRoche: "I hope you have a slow, miserable time in your cage." In 1974, Carla Walker was a 17-year-old junior at Western Hills High School in Fort Worth, Texas. Just 4'11", Carla had honey blonde hair that fell below her shoulders. She was dating Rodney McCoy. He was described as a wiry, good-natured kid who was the quarterback of the football team. Rodney and Carla talked about enrolling together at Texas Tech University. She told her closest friends that she had no doubt that she and Rodney would someday marry and start a family. The evening of February 16th of 1974, Rodney arrived at the Walkers' home in Benbrook in far west Fort Worth to take Carla to the school's Valentine's Day dance. When the event ended around 11:30, Rodney invited another couple to cruise Camp Bowie Boulevard and the Benbrook traffic circle with him and Carla. They stopped at a couple of teen hangouts, Mr. Quick Hamburgers and Taco Bell. After dropping off the others, Rodney and Carla drove to a nearby bowling alley, Brunswick Ridgely Bowl, where Carla used the restroom. Not long after Carla climbed in the car, the passenger door flew open. Rodney caught a glimpse of a tall man with short brown hair. He began bludgeoning Rodney over the head with the butt of a pistol. At some point, the gun's magazine clip dislodged and fell into the parking lot. The man grabbed Carla. Rodney, barely conscious, heard him say, "You're coming with me, aren't you, sweetie?" "Rodney, go get my dad," Carla said. "Go, get my dad." Rodney came to the driver's seat sometime around 1 a.m. He sped to the Walkers' home, which was less than a mile away. He drove up over the curb onto the front lawn and slammed on the brakes. Carla's parents, Leighton and Doris, were still awake playing dominoes in the dining room with relatives. Carla's little brother Jim, who was 12 years old, and her elder sister Cindy, who was 18, were in the living room watching television. They heard someone banging at the front door and were stunned to see Rodney, blood dripping down his face. He was frantic. "Mr. Walker, they've got her," he shouted. "They're gonna hurt her bad." Leighton, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, grabbed his pistol and raced to the bowling alley. Doris dialed the operator on the family's rotary phone and asked to be connected to the police. Searching the parking lot, they found Carla's purse along with the magazine clip that had been ejected from the assailant's weapon. Other cops drove the surrounding streets in squad cars, scanning for any sign of Carla. After the sun rose, more joined the hunt. Peering through binoculars, a few circled the city in helicopters. When classes resumed on Monday morning, detectives visited Western Hills High. They studied contact sheets of photos taken at the dance, looking for anyone who seemed out of place. They stopped kids in the hallways, asking if they knew anyone who would want to hurt Carla. On February 20th of 1974, 4 days after Carla's disappearance, two of the officers assigned to look for her were driving along a remote 2-lane road near Benbrook Lake about 5 miles southwest of the bowling alley. They spotted a culvert and a concrete tunnel built to let water flow beneath the road and pulled over to peer inside. They saw a young woman lying on her back. Her face and neck were covered with scratches and deep bruises. It was Carla. It appeared that she had been strangled because there were no ligature marks around her neck. Investigators believed that the culprit had choked her using his hands. News of what happened to Carla covered almost the entire front page of the Star-Telegram. Her funeral, which was held at the Western Hills Church of Christ, was attended by more than 1,250 mourners, far more than the small sanctuary could hold. Fort Worth officials formed a task force of detectives from the area's police departments. The group didn't have much to investigate. No fingerprints had been identified on Carla's body or clothing. The blood on her dress had come from Rodney's head wounds. Traces of bodily fluid had been found, but the technology did not yet exist to identify a person from their DNA. And in that era, there were no surveillance cameras in parking lots and no license plate readers on the sides of the highways. The group did set up a 24-hour telephone tip line. At the downtown police headquarters, officers sat behind metal desks, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to citizens pass on the names of men they believed were responsible. The detectives were told by various callers that Carla's life was taken by a pair of marijuana dealers, by a carnival worker at the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo, and by a quiet young man who often bowled alone at the alley where Carla had been kidnapped. They heard stories about a boy who had supposedly gotten into an argument with Rodney at Mr. Quick Hamburgers the night before the dance. The detectives also hired a hypnotist to try to draw more details out of Rodney, who suffered a head injury during the incident. But the most significant memory he managed to recall was that Carla's kidnapper had been wearing a brown or tan cowboy hat. When the hypnotist snapped his fingers and Rodney awoke, he burst into tears. He was all torn up inside, tormented that he couldn't save his girlfriend. During one meeting, the task force detectives discussed another unsolved case that had taken place on February 7th of 1973, almost exactly a year before Carla's. That night, a young woman named Becky Martin did not return home after attending a night class at Tarrant County Junior College's South Campus. Her body was found almost 7 weeks later. It was so decomposed that there was no way to determine the cause. The medical examiner said Becky could have been stabbed or strangled or even shot through the stomach. What most intrigued the detectives about Becky's case was where her body had been found, in a culvert just outside the city limits. The two girls in two culverts, a year apart. It just seemed too coincidental for investigators. Although they said nothing publicly, the investigators began looking for a serial offender. By March, a month after Carla's life was taken, all the task force had to go on was one small lead. The detectives learned that the magazine clip found in the bowling alley parking lot belonged to a newer model .22 Ruger handgun. They asked the federal government's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to provide them with the names of anyone living in Fort Worth who had purchased that model. The ATF came up with a list of a couple dozen people, and the task force set out to interview each one of them. One man on the list was 31-year-old truck driver named Glenn McCurley. McCurley was raised in West Texas, the eldest of 3 boys. When he was a teenager, his parents sent him to the Westviews Boys Home in southwestern Oklahoma. Westview, which is sponsored by the Churches of Christ, promotes itself as a place for those who are deprived due to sickness in their family, boys experiencing significant problems in living with their family, boys needing supervision, and delinquent boys, those who have violated the law but who are not in need of treatment or detention, and abandoned, abused, or neglected boys. It's not clear why McCurley was sent to the home or precisely how long he was there, but his stay clearly wasn't transformative. By February of 1961, he had left Westview and was in Abilene, Texas, where he stole a car. Then, he abandoned that car and stole another one. The State Highway Patrol began to pursue him and shot out one of his tires. He drove the vehicle onto a vacant lot and attempted to escape on foot, but was quickly captured. In court, McCurley pleaded guilty and received a 2-year sentence. He was released early in the spring of 1962 when he was 19. He eventually moved to Midland, where he met a blonde high school student named Judy Watson. On February 16th of 1963, McCurley married Judy in a Baptist church. The young couple moved into a small rental home. McCurley eventually got a job as a truck driver for the U.S. Postal Service with a route to Dallas, Fort Worth area. Judy gave birth to 2 sons, Craig and Roddy. Then, in 1972, McCurley moved his young family to a neighborhood in West Fort Worth. McCurley and Judy enrolled their boys in the public elementary school and they joined Ridgely West Baptist Church. McCurley got another truck driving job, hauling prefabricated slabs of concrete to construction sites. Judy worked at the church's daycare center. One man who knew McCurley did note a distasteful habit. He'd see a pretty girl and say something like, "Take a look at that." In early March of 1974, 2 detectives arrived at McCurley's home to interview him about his Ruger .22 pistol. When the officers asked about the gun, McCurley said that it had been stolen 6 weeks earlier from his pickup truck while he was fishing. He then agreed to come to downtown and take a polygraph test, which he passed. The task force promptly eliminated him as a potential suspect. By late spring of 1974, investigators still had little to show for their work. The task force didn't officially disband, but many of the detectives were ordered by their supervisors to return to their other cases. Strangers would occasionally call the Walkers' house, many of them anonymously, claiming they had information about who ended Carla's life. Layton talked to all of them. He took notes and kept them in a metal box the size of a cigar box. He wrote down names and addresses of potential suspects, and he drew circles on maps where he had been told the culprit lived. He was not going to rest until he knew the man responsible was behind bars. When Carla's younger brother Jim turned 16 and got his driver's license, he began spending his free time helping his dad hunt for the perpetrator. Sometimes on the anniversary, he would prowl the parking lot of the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl looking for anyone suspicious. Jim took boxing lessons at the Panther Boys Club, joined the high school's wrestling and football teams, and went on long runs through his neighborhood. "I wanted to be ready in case I ever came across the culprit," Jim said. "My plan was to overpower him and take him someplace far away, maybe somewhere out in West Texas where no one can hear him scream." On February 19th of 1977, almost precisely 3 years after Carla's body was found, someone came across the body of 25-year-old June Ward, a vocational nurse lying next to a curb in South Fort Worth. June was naked except for a bra strap wrapped around her neck. She'd been strangled and beaten over the head with what the one reporter described as a sharp, heavy object. Detectives who had worked on the Carla Walker task force couldn't help but notice the similarities between the 2 crimes. Then, on July 9th of 1980, the body of a 19-year-old woman named Denise Hogue, described in the newspaper as an unemployed drifter, was found a few feet from a creek bridge in South Fort Worth. She too had been strangled. 2.5 years later, in February of 1983, the body of Christy Tower, a waitress at the family Billy Bob's Texas nightclub in the Stockyards, was discovered in a field north of the city. Her hands were bound with electrical wire, and another wire was twisted around her neck. Like the other crimes, Christy's case remained a mystery. Though, a few days after her body was found, detectives received a curious bit of news. They learned that Christy's purse had been found in a dumpster behind Cheers, a bar on Champ Bowie Boulevard. Cheers was only a half a mile from the Brunswick Ridgely bowling parking lot, the place where Carla had been kidnapped in February of 1974. Residents were getting more worried about the prospect of a serial offender. Such concerns grew when Catherine Davis, a 23-year-old aspiring model, went missing on September 9th of 1984. Her body was found in a field in far South Fort Worth. About a month later, on October 19th, Marilyn Hartman, a 25-year-old middle school teacher, was found gagged and strangled in her Fort Worth bedroom. Just 3 days after that, Cindy Heller, a 23-year-old Texas Christian University graduate and former beauty contestant, disappeared after last being seen near Hewlin Mall. She was later found strangled in a creek bed on the Texas Christian University campus. The tragedies kept piling up. On November 26th of 1984, Katherine Jackson, another local middle school teacher, was found naked in her bathtub with the water still running. She had been strangled with a cord. 2 weeks after that, Angela Ewert, a 21-year-old part-time model and programmer for an FM rock station, left her fiancé's house in southwest Fort Worth. The following day, her car was found abandoned by a highway in a southern part of the city, and her decomposed remains were eventually discovered in a field north of Fort Worth. On the evening of December 22nd, just days before Christmas, 21-year-old Regina Grover was seen with her boyfriend walking out of the Keg, a restaurant on Camp Bowie. She was found the next day, strangled and drowned in a creek under a bridge in North Fort Worth. Her boyfriend, who was found in his bed at his apartment, had been fatally bludgeoned. Fort Worth women, especially those living in the southwestern part of the city, were panicking. Local media reported on skyrocketing gun and mace sales. When the police department offered a free seminar on self-defense, more than 3,000 attended, most of them women. The police department formed another task force. "We're going to break this thing," Police Chief H.F. Hopkins promised. Detectives questioned every suspect, from ex-cons with long rap sheets to a freelance photographer. The investigation, though, was fruitless. The only welcome news was a lull in crimes. The culprit, if it was one culprit, seemed to have retreated. That was until February 24th of 1986. A passerby came across a woman's unclothed body, partially wrapped in a blanket, lying on a hillside near a park in central Fort Worth. She had been strangled, but the police could not identify her through the usual means, fingerprints, or dental records. Nor did they receive any reports about a missing woman that might have provided a clue. Another year passed, and then another, and this time it really did appear as if the unknown man committing all these crimes had retreated for good. Carla Walker's little brother Jim had not given up. After graduating from Western Hills High, Jim had attended Sam Houston State University, where he read books on serial offenders and took courses in abnormal psychology so that he could better understand what he described as the criminal mind. After he graduated from college, he moved back to Fort Worth and applied to become an officer with the city's police department. His plan was to get promoted to detective and get his hands on Carla's files and find the man responsible. During a training session at the academy's firing range, however, Jim noticed something was wrong with his eyesight. A doctor later diagnosed him with a congenital eye condition. Forced to drop out of the academy, he went to work in security at a local Office of Defense contractor General Dynamics. But he continued hunting for the man responsible. After his father passed away in 1987 of a heart attack, Jim dug through the notes in Layton's metal box looking for new leads to pursue. After his mother passed away in 2015, Jim purchased his parents' home and moved into it with his wife. "I wanted to be there in case somebody ever got a conscience at 3 in the morning and showed up to confess," he said. In January of 2019, Detectives Leah Wagner and Officer Jeff Bennett decided to take another look at Carla's case after Jim made a request. Among those they re-interviewed was Carla's then-boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, who had moved to Alaska as soon as he graduated from high school to work on an oil rig, telling his family that he needed to get as far away from Fort Worth as possible. He eventually returned to Texas and was living near Austin when Wagner and Bennett reached him. To try to locate new witnesses, investigators posted a message on the police department's Facebook page. They got a couple dozen responses, including one from a woman who claimed that her ex-husband had grown up in the same neighborhood as Carla and had kept a stash of newspaper articles about her case, which he occasionally reread. A likely sign, said the ex-wife, that he was responsible. No doubt to the ex-wife's disappointment, the ex-husband was able to prove he'd been out of town the weekend Carla's life was taken. What the detectives needed was physical evidence, and the best physical evidence they could hope to find, of course, was the culprit's DNA. Since Carla lost her life, the technology of DNA identification had not only been developed, but had progressed beyond anyone's expectations. There were now even laboratories that specialized in genealogical mapping, in which technicians use freely accessible databases to link DNA from an unknown person to the DNA of that person's relatives. Fortunately for Wagner and Bennett, Carla's dress and other clothing she'd worn the night her life was ended had been carefully packed away in paper bags in the police department's evidence lab, which meant there was a chance that technicians still could turn up a usable sample of DNA. After all these years, however, there was no way of knowing whether the DNA had degraded, which would prevent the technicians from compiling a full genetic profile of the man responsible. Once more, conducting DNA tests on Carla's clothes could cost the Fort Worth Police Department as much as $20,000, money that was more likely to go towards active cases. Wagner and Bennett were determined to find at least one good lead, but they knew the odds were against them. Then, their investigation took an unpredictable turn. Vincent Strange was a 40-year-old Fort Worth aerospace technician and true crime buff. In 2017, he created a podcast about unsolved cases in Texas. His first story was going to be about Carla Walker, whose case he had read about while poking around the internet. He interviewed Carla's siblings, Jim and Cindy, as well as a few of her friends. One person who did listen to it was Diane Kuykendall. Diane had gone to school with Carla. Carla always smiled at her in the hallway, even though they didn't really know each other. Diane said it made her feel good, and that she wishes that there was some way that she could pay Carla back. Diane decided to fly to Nashville to attend CrimeCon, an annual 3-day true crime convention that most recently attracted some 5,000 people. She brought along 80 copies of a pamphlet she had written about Carla's case. She handed out the pamphlets to the likes of Dateline's Keith Morrison, Fox News' Nancy Grace, and Paul Holes, a retired investigator who works for the Oxygen Network. Paul Holes was intrigued and convinced Oxygen to pay $18,000 to cover the cost of DNA testing on Carla's clothes. At a lab in California, technicians found some intact, untainted bodily fluid were found. From that fluid, they were able to develop a full DNA profile, which they uploaded to CODIS, a nationwide law enforcement database that contains the DNA of millions of criminal offenders. CODIS, however, couldn't find a match. Paul Holes and his producers contacted a Texas lab that also does genealogical mapping, but technicians there had no luck either. David Middleman, CEO of Othram, then got into contact with Paul Holes. He said he was optimistic that his particular DNA identification method, a sophisticated technology that used genome sequencing, could find a match. The morning of July 4th of 2020, David Middleman called Officer Bennett. "We've connected the DNA to a particular family tree," he said. "The last name is McCurley." After some further testing and police work, Middleman and Bennett landed on Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr., who had been living in Fort Worth at the time of Carla's demise. Bennett saw Glenn McCurley Jr. was the truck driver who had told the police back in 1974 that his Ruger 22 had been stolen. Wagner and Bennett did a background check on McCurley, but there was little to learn. As far as they could tell, other than his 1961 criminal conviction for stealing a car when he was 18, he had no encounters with the police. McCurley was no longer driving trucks full-time by then. He took on handyman jobs and did part-time maintenance work at a fitness club. Wagner and Bennett decided to pay him a visit. They arrived unannounced at the McCurleys' home. McCurley and his wife Judy politely invited the detectives into the living room and chatted amiably. McCurley talked about his old truck driving gigs. Judy said she had spent 32 years at Ridgely West Baptist Daycare Program, finally retiring in 2004 because of health issues. She also mentioned that her husband suffered from diabetes and that he'd recently had surgery to remove a tumor the size of a quarter on his liver. "We're not ready for this," Judy said, "especially with his cancer." Finally, McCurley asked the detectives, his voice raspy, "What do y'all want to talk about?" "We're gonna take you way, way back," Wagner said. "Back in 1974. Y'all were living here at the time, so you may have heard about it. There was a young lady kidnapped from a bowling alley." "I know exactly which one you're talking about," Judy immediately said. "Carla Walker." Judy later told detectives she could remember where the Walker family lived on Williams Road. "They kept her room the same way it was," she said. "They kept her car still parked in the driveway for years and years. You'd drive by and see that car parked in the driveway, and it was just absolutely heartbreaking." Detective Wagner said that she and Bennett had reopened the investigation and were contacting those who had been interviewed by police in 1974. "It's a huge case," she said, "and we saw at one point they had talked to you, Mr. McCurley." Wagner asked McCurley if she could take a DNA sample. It would be the easiest way to eliminate him as a suspect, she explained. McCurley hesitated. Then he took a pen, signed a consent form, and opened his mouth so Wagner could dab the inside of his cheek with a Q-tip. Looking on, Judy told the detectives, "I hope you find out who is responsible. That girl needs to be remembered as someone who mattered." 11 days later, after lab techs verified that the DNA from McCurley's cheek perfectly matched the DNA found on Carla's bra strap, the members of the U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force arrived at his house to arrest him. He was driven downtown to the police department, where he waived his right to have a lawyer present during his interrogation. For several minutes, he sat alone in an interview room. At first, he denied any involvement. He claimed he had never seen Carla Walker before. Finally, he said with tears welling in his eyes, "Okay, I did do it, I guess." He told the detectives that on the afternoon of February 16th of 1974, he had drunk whiskey and beer for several hours. He said he began driving around and parked in some parking lots. At one point, he drove to the bowling ball place. It seemed as if McCurley was about to confess. Instead, he told the detectives he'd heard a girl screaming in a nearby car. "I went over there to see if I could help. This big guy had her up against the door, jerking her around." McCurley said he opened the front passenger door and gotten into a tussle with the boy. He pushed him off Carla, led her back to his car, and then drove her to another parking lot. She started hugging me, thanking me, and one thing led to another. He claimed that everything that happened between him and Carla was consensual, and he did not know what had happened to her after that. After speaking to his court-appointed attorneys, McCurley pleaded not guilty. His attorneys argued in their court filings that Othram Labs' DNA test was flawed, and that Wagner and Bennett had coerced McCurley into a false confession. The attorneys also portrayed McCurley as feeble. "This man poses no threat to anyone. As far as I can tell, he has led an utterly uneventful life." 9 months later, on June 16th of 2021, the first pretrial hearing open to the public took place. Wearing a green jail-issued jumpsuit, McCurley was pushed into the courtroom in a wheelchair. When the actual trial got underway, a few months later, Carla's boyfriend Rodney testified about the night she vanished. Retired Detective Jim Minter took the stand to talk about the original investigation into Carla's case, and Wagner and Bennett testified about their own police work. Prosecutors D'Avignon and Emily Dixon unfolded the powder blue dress Carla had been wearing the night she was abducted and presented it to the jury. They also played 3 hours of the videotaped interview that Wagner and Bennett had conducted with McCurley after his arrest. And then, the prosecutors revealed a surprise piece of evidence, McCurley's .22 Ruger, which he claimed had been stolen. Police had discovered it during a search of his home hidden away in a compartment above a door. The case, of course, was open and shut. On the third day of the trial, McCurley changed his plea to guilty, and the judge quickly sentenced him to life in prison. In the aftermath of the trial, there were still a lot of questions. Why would Glenn McCurley, a man with no violent criminal record, have committed such a sadistic crime? Was it an impulsive, drunken act? Or was McCurley a depraved serial offender who was also responsible for taking the lives of other young Fort Worth women? And if he was a serial offender, why did he suddenly stop in the mid-80s? Did he have a genuine change of heart? Was that even possible? Investigators believe McCurley is responsible for many other crimes, and the investigations are currently ongoing.